The first whisper did not come from a scientist or a satellite. It came from a trembling voice buried inside a corrupted transmission, a fragment of a message never meant to reach the world above. When investigators first replayed the file, the audio cracked with interference so dense it felt almost intentional, as though the storm outside the research station had grown teeth and begun chewing through the signal. Yet beneath the distortion, a single sentence survactant, shaking, and wrapped in a fear too quiet to fake the ice. It is hollow. Something is moving. And with that, the silence surrounding Antarctica, the kind of silence that swallows whole centuries without complaint, began to fracture. The team that recorded the message had already vanished by the time the leak surfaced. What little remained of their equipment was found weeks later, frozen into a single rigid slab like insects caught in amber. But the transmission did more than expose a disappearance. It marked the moment the continent began to speak again, in a language made not of words, but of vibrations, steady, patient, deliberate, and for those who listened closely, the rhythm it carried was unmistakable. Every 62 seconds, beneath more than 2 miles of ancient ice, a pulse rose and fell like the heartbeat of something that had waited a very long time to be heard. At first, analysts assumed it was glacial movement, the slow groan of a world shifting under its own weight. But when they overlaid the vibrations with archived deep space listening logs, the data aligned with a match so precise it froze the room. The Antarctic pulse was identical to the core signature once detected near the orbit of Nibiru. Not similar, not reminiscent, identical. The pattern that had baffled astronomers decades earlier was now resurfacing from beneath Earth's oldest ice, as though the planet itself were echoing a memory it had no right to hold. The match should have been impossible. Yet within classified halls and dimly lit laboratories, conversations shifted from probability to intention. Natural forces do not replicate extraterrestrial signatures. Geological systems do not keep time with mechanical precision. And if two worlds separated by vast distances spoke with the same pulse, then something or someone had built the bridge between them long before human history began. Still, none of this could be said aloud. Reports were sealed, hard drives confiscated, and staff reassigned under new names and new duties. But the ice, indifferent to secrecy, continued its rhythm. Every 62 seconds, it breathed. Every 62 seconds, it called. Months after the transmission, a reconnaissance drone veered off course while skimming the edge of a restricted Antarctic zone. Control logs show no anomaly, no error, no malfunction. Just a smooth line of flight until the camera feed dissolved into a white shimmer like frost blooming across glass. Then, abruptly, the brightness sharpened into geometry. A triangular burst of golden light cut upward through the storm, slicing the ice with a precision so clean it looked surgical. For a fraction of a second, the drone's camera caught the impossible, a chamber beneath the ice arranged with intention, with angles too perfect and layers too symmetrical to be shaped by erosion or time. Engineers later described the drone's final data chip as burned from the inside, heat signatures traced along the circuitry in patterns matching the frequency emitted from below the ice. Whatever the drone had witnessed, the recording itself seemed to have been seared by it. There was one frame, though blurred, distorted, incomplete, that escaped total corruption. In it, the edges of the chamber curve inward like the ribs of a colossal machine, each rib pulsing with the faintest hint of light, not glowing, not active, but remembering how to be alive. And in that single image, hidden behind the distortion, analysts found something even more unsettling. The chamber was not carved into the bedrock. It was built into it, integrated, as if the continent had been shaped around a structure far older than the ice that now concealed it. The military shut everything down within minutes. Files were locked, satellites were redirected, no-fly zones expanded without explanation. But shutting down information is not the same as shutting down a continent. And Antarctica, ancient and patient, continued to pulse beneath its white veil. Researchers still on site began reporting sensations they could not name. Vibrations too soft to measure but too steady to ignore. Snow lifting in shallow waves, rising and falling as though stirred by breath. Instruments malfunctioned with rhythmic regularity, failing for exactly 3 seconds before aligning again. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, pausing at intervals that lined up perfectly with the 62-second cycle emerging from below. Some nights, when the temperature dropped low enough for the air to feel brittle, the ice itself seemed to listen. Cracks formed not in chaotic spreads but in branching patterns that mirrored the shape of ancient hexagon structures that appeared in no geological model but repeated across artifacts attributed to Anunnaki engineering. The resemblance was subtle, easy to dismiss, but those who studied the fragments understood the implication. A blueprint was pushing upward, trying to reveal itself through the ice that had buried it for millennia. If the continent was a machine, then something within it was turning back on. And yet, there was no roar of engines, no violent shift, no dramatic upheaval, only a patient awakening in ancient mechanism warming after a long sleep, whispering through stone and water and frozen time. The drone's final audio file captured that whisper in a faint metallic resonance, a low hum rising through static, steady as a metronome. deliberate as an invocation. When slowed down and cleaned of interference, the hum revealed a structure, layers of harmonic decay descending in spirals that matched deep space readings of Nibiru's internal resonance. This was not natural geology. This was not the groan of a continent. This was a response. A call returning to a call. As the analysts sat in stunned silence, the room filled with a quiet realization not spoken, not confirmed, but shared in the shallow breath everyone took at once. Antarctica was not waking alone. It was answering something. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of satellites and telescopes, that something was listening. They were not the first to hear it. Long before humans argued over charts and recordings, something older, quieter, and closer to the ice had already begun to respond. It happened without announcement, without alarms, and at first without witnesses. Just a slow rearranging of life in a place the world assumes is empty. The earliest hint did not come from ground level at all, but from a silent arc of metal drifting hundreds of miles above the pole. A climate satellite, programmed to ignore anything that looked like noise, began flagging movement along a restricted band of coastline. The images showed nothing dramatic, no storms, no fractures, no collapsing shelves, just a subtle darkening of the snow along a narrow fault line miles from the nearest research outpost, as if the ice itself had grown a shadow. When technicians enhanced the images, the shadow broke apart into shapes, not random, not scattered, but arranged. An entire penguin colony had abandoned its usual nesting grounds and collected around a single fracture in the ice, forming a dense ring far too symmetrical to be dismissed as chance. They stood facing inward, hundreds of them, encircling a point the satellite could not see, as though listening to something rising from below. The behavior made no sense. Generations of birds had followed the same paths, nested in the same ridges, moved in waves, guided by food and season. Yet here they were, clustered in a pattern that looked less like migration and more like a vigil. They did not forage. They did not wander. They simply remained, still and silent, while snow rippled faintly around their feet every 62 seconds. When the images reached a small group of analysts, the initial reaction was to blame the equipment. Ice patterns could be misleading. Brightness values could invert under certain angles, but then more data arrived from another satellite, using a different sensor, on a different orbit. The second series of images confirmed what the first had hinted. The ring of penguins was real, and they were not alone. Further out, along a stretch of jagged shore, seals had shifted course. Instead of spreading themselves along cracks in the ice to rest, they had converged on a single, seemingly insignificant fissure. Seen from above, their bodies traced a spiral, curling inward, toward the same epicenter the penguins were circling on land, as if the water and the ice were both answering a silent summons. It was the thermal scans that removed any doubt. When the region was observed through infrared, the fault line lit up with an eerie softness. Beneath more than 2 miles of frozen crust, a thread of warmth pulsed upward, expanding in concentric waves every 62 seconds, like the exhale of something buried. The heat was not intense, just enough to register as a glow against the cold, but it was precise. The pattern did not drift. It did not weaken. It arrived on time, again and again, as if measured against an invisible clock. The animals had arranged themselves exactly along the edge of that thermal spiral, not above it, not away from it, but right where the warmth brushed closest to the surface. The penguins stood in a ring that mirrored the outermost curve. The seals traced its path in the water. Together, they formed a living contour line over a map no human eye had yet fully seen. Biologists consulted for an explanation, spoke of instinct and sensitivity. Animals, they argued, often detect subtle changes long before instruments do, shifts in magnetic fields, vibrations, the faintest suggestion of danger or opportunity. But even they grew quiet when the hexagons appeared. At first, the fractures around the fault line looked ordinary, the kind of jagged cracks that lace any landscape under stress. Thin white scars snaking away from a central point. Yet as days passed and the pulse continued, the breaks began to reassemble themselves into something else. Sharp angles emerged where curves should have formed. Lines that had spread chaotically now converged at precise junctions, meeting at neat, repeating intersections. From above, the pattern resolved into a geometry the ice should not know how to draw. Six-sided shapes bloomed across the surface, their edges aligned with the direction of the rising warmth. Each new tremor sharpened them, as though the continent were tracing faint memory lines buried deep within its frozen body. Those who had studied ancient blueprints from Sumerian tablets and forbidden archives recognized the shape, even if they refused to say so at first. The hexagon was a favorite of a civilization that predated human empires, a geometry used to stabilize energy flows, to distribute stress evenly across vast structures, to guide resonance through stone and metal as though guiding a song through an instrument. In their diagrams, the hexagon was not decoration. It was function. It was design. Seeing it now, written not on clay but on ice, felt like reading an old language reappearing in a new medium. In the following days, the animals did not disperse. They adjusted. The ring of penguins tightened and loosened with slow, almost ceremonial shifts, realigning themselves along the freshest cracks as the pattern evolved. Some of them stood with their heads tilted downward, beaks aimed toward the faint stream of warmth, as though listening through the soles of their feet. Researchers on the ground, unaware of the classified thermal data above them, began filing small, puzzled reports. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarm, just notes about strange clustering, abandoned nesting sites, unusual stillness. Field notes that would ordinarily be archived and forgotten. Yet with each new entry, the same coordinates reappeared, the same fracture line, the same quiet gathering. It was as if the living world around Antarctica had decided, without consultation or language, that something important was happening beneath that line in the ice, and that it would not look away. Instruments placed near the region started to pick up more than the pulse. Between each 62-second thrum, the ground emitted a whisper-soft vibration, a faint tremor too gentle to be classified as seismic activity, but too consistent to dismiss. Snow at the edge of the fracture lifted in shallow, rhythmic waves, rising subtly as the warmth swelled, falling back as it cooled like the chest of a sleeping creature breathing in slow motion. At night, under skies clear enough to show every star, the fracture took on a different character. Moonlight slid into its depths, casting long, thin shadows along the newly formed hexagonal ridges. To human eyes, it might have looked like a crack in an old window. To anything that still remembered the patterns of Anunnaki architecture, it would have looked like the surface of a doorway beginning to remember its shape. Something about the timing unsettled those who had seen the match to Nibiru's pulse. The animals were not reacting to a storm, or a quake, or a sudden noise. They were responding to a rhythm that had not existed on Earth in any recorded age. A rhythm older than their species, older than the ice, older than the civilizations that would one day name them and draw them on maps. Yet they moved as if they recognized it. As days blurred into nights and the pulse held steady, a strange calm settled over the region. Birds that would normally squabble for space fell quiet. Seals rested in near-perfect alignment along the spiral, rising and dipping with the breath of unseen currents. The landscape, harsh and merciless to most life, had become something else, a kind of chamber, a waiting room carved from snow and silence, where every living creature present had unconsciously taken its place. If someone had stood there, between the ring of penguins and the spiral of seals, with the knowledge to read patterns instead of events, they might have understood what the continent was trying to say. The pulse was not just energy, it was instruction. The hexagons were not just fractures, they were outlines. And the animals, in their quiet obedience, were not just responding. They were helping trace the first visible circle around a switch the world had forgotten existed. Long before any human ear noticed it, the sound had already threaded itself through miles of ice, moving with a patience that suggested it had learned long ago how to wait. At first it was nothing more than a faint tremor, too soft to register as danger, too rhythmic to be dismissed as chance. But as the pulse deepened, as the continent adjusted itself around the invisible center of its awakening, the noise began to change. And then, one quiet dawn, a seismic station sitting alone on a wind-swept ridge captured what researchers later described as a heartbeat made of metal. The recording lasted less than 9 seconds. That was all the equipment could withstand before its sensors overloaded and shut down. But 9 seconds were enough. When the audio was slowed down and cleaned of static, the pattern emerged with clarity, both unnerving and strangely elegant. A rising hum, a moment of stillness, a descending echo shaped like the slow exhale of a machine too vast to imagine. Then, exactly 62 seconds later, the same hum returned, identical in amplitude, pitch, decay, and resonance. It was as if the ice itself were keeping time. Seismic anomalies are often chaotic, messy bursts of vibration drifting unpredictably through stone and frozen layers. But this signal moved with the intentionality of a heartbeat, radiating outward like a perfectly measured wave. When technicians plotted the pulses onto a map, the results appeared almost artificial. The ripples formed a perfect circle nearly 50 miles across, centered on the same region where the penguins had gathered, and the seals had spiraled into their living mandala. Nature does not draw lines this cleanly. Machines do. At first, the anomaly was classified as a rare harmonic resonance, unusual, yes, but not unprecedented. Yet as more stations across the continent began picking up the same metallic thrum, the anomaly grew harder to explain. The waves did not weaken as they traveled. They did not distort. They maintained their structure with unnerving precision, like a message being broadcast from beneath the crust, repeated at intervals too perfect for any natural fault. By the end of the week, the phenomenon could no longer be contained within scientific reports. Field researchers began experiencing the pulses physically, not painfully, not violently, but unmistakably. A soft pressure behind the sternum, a faint tightening in the jaw, a sensation at the base of the spine like the touch of a distant magnet pulling gently inward. Some described it as standing too close to heavy machinery. Others said it felt like the moment before thunder, when the air grows dense with expectation. One researcher woke in the night, convinced the pulse had entered her dreams. She described seeing long corridors lined with smooth, dark metal that vibrated like the strings of a low instrument. Light traveled down the walls in thin golden threads, pulsing at the same 62-second rhythm rising from the ice. When she tried to move toward the source, she felt the ground shift beneath her, reshaping itself not to hinder her but to guide her. When she opened her eyes, the pulse was still there, thudding faintly through the cot beneath her body. It was around this time that the survey teams began to disappear. The first group vanished without alarm. Their last radio message was routine, a simple check-in, a note about heading toward a new fracture line, nothing out of the ordinary. When they failed to respond the next day, a search party was dispatched. The snow around their last known coordinates was undisturbed, the wind patterns untouched, the tracks they'd left behind simply ending as though they had walked into the air and dissolved. The second team disappeared more dramatically. Their transmission came in mid-pulse, crackling with feedback like a microphone held too close to an amplifier. Through the distortion, a single voice broke through a whisper that barely held itself together. "It is not natural." Then a violent surge of interference and silence. What the search crews found at their camp was stranger still. Their tents stood intact. Their equipment was arranged neatly. Their instruments, however, had been turned inwards, not toward the sky or the horizon, but toward the ground, as though the researchers had begun scanning directly into the ice beneath their feet. Data logs showed nothing but a repeating error message, signal overload, resonance too high. Even with the equipment powered off, a faint vibration clung to the metal frames of the instruments, as if something beneath the surface refused to let them rest. As weeks passed and the tremor remained unbroken, deeper layers of the ice began to respond. Microfractures formed not in chaotic patterns, but in radiating spokes, extending outward like the arms of a great wheel, turning slowly beneath the crust. Thermal scans revealed thin rivers of heat threading through the fractures, moving with a coordinated rhythm that suggested fluid dynamics, but with a precision fluid never achieves on its own. In one late-night session, an analyst compared the spread of microfractures to a blueprint found in a forbidden Sumerian archive, an architectural diagram of an awakening chamber said to lie beneath the throne of a forgotten sky god. The resemblance was undeniable. Both depicted a central hub surrounded by channels that distributed energy and pulses. Both relied on hexagonal symmetry. Both had been described as sleeping mechanisms awaiting reactivation. The analyst submitted one report before requesting reassignment. The report never reached the public, nor the scientific community. But the pattern it described continued to unfold beneath Antarctica, growing more defined with every beat of the metallic heart below. Researchers began to notice something else, something they could neither explain nor ignore. The pulse was not only rising from the center, it was traveling outward as well, moving in concentric rings across the continent, as though the machine beneath the ice were mapping the terrain above it, rediscovering the shape of the world it had once belonged to. Those who spent enough time in the field reported strange incidents at the exact moment the pulse peaked. Compasses twitching in unison, snow lifting in gentle spirals, shadows shifting where no light had changed. Some claimed to hear a faint voice in the vibration, not made of words, but of intention. A call not directed at them, but through them. And beneath the accumulating dread, beneath the frozen silence stretching across the continent like a breath held too long, there was an undertone of something else, an awareness growing inside the ice. A presence returning slowly from a distance far older than Earth's recorded ages. The pulse was no longer just a signal. It was a heartbeat. And Antarctica, long thought to be lifeless stone and ancient frost, was waking to its own sound. Long before satellites drifted overhead or research stations dotted the frozen horizon, Antarctica lived a different life, one so distant from its present that modern science treats it as an abstraction. A chapter written in a language the Earth no longer remembers how to speak, but the ice remembers. Buried within its layered breadths of snow and pressure are subtle distortions, traces of warmth, particles that never belonged to this latitude, sediments shaped by rivers that once carved their way beneath golden light. Antarctica was not always a white silence stretching to the edge of the world. It was warm, lush, alive. Yet the transition from that ancient vitality to the present wasteland did not unfold with the slow patience of natural climate cycles. The geological record does not lie, and in this case, it does not whisper either. It speaks with the clarity of catastrophe. A shift occurred, abrupt, precise, and so violently efficient that soil became ice within layers so thin they defy the explanation of any known glacial mechanism. It was as though someone had lowered a planetary switch and sealed an entire world beneath a single command: freeze. For decades, this anomaly was dismissed as a quirk of data, a misinterpretation born of incomplete sampling, but the deeper researchers drilled, the less room remained for doubt. Tropical pollen trapped beneath ancient frost, sediment structures indicating sudden, unnatural cooling, and within some layers thin traces of metallic dust arranged in micropatterns too uniform to be natural. The particles refract light in strange, angular ways, forming geometric shadows faintly visible under magnification. When analyzed, they match nothing known on Earth. Nothing from meteorites, nothing of volcanic origin. They are, quite simply, out of place. The first scholars to study them quietly compared these patterns to artifacts unearthed across early Mesopotamia, artifacts linked not to humans, but to the mythic architects the ancients called the Anunnaki. These comparisons never made it into peer-reviewed journals. Instead, They circulated through private channels, whispered across encrypted networks, as a question no one dared ask openly. What if the continent did not freeze by accident? What if it was sealed? It is here that the forbidden maps re-enter the story maps the world knows, but seldom looks at closely. The Piri race map of 1513 is the most famous among them. On its yellowed surface lies a coastline that should not exist. Antarctica, drawn centuries before humans supposedly knew it was there. Not only drawn, but shown free of ice. Its rivers and mountains matching modern seismic scans with uncanny accuracy. Mainstream historians call it a coincidence or a misinterpretation. Yet misinterpretations do not replicate subglacial riverbeds hidden beneath 2 miles of frozen crust. Beside Peri Race lie lesser-known maps from the Orontius Phineas and Haji Ahmed collections, each depicting the southern continent not as barren, but as warm, fertile, inhabited by rivers flowing freely into ancient seas. These cartographers did not possess aircraft, radar, or satellite imaging. They possessed stories, fragments, knowledge given or preserved. Knowledge of a world before the switch was thrown. The truth embedded in these maps is not that ancient humans charted Antarctica. It is that someone charted it for them, across multiple cultures, scattered thousands of miles apart. Old scrolls describe a land in the far south, where the horizon shimmered with metallic light, where skyborn architects moved across the surface shaping storms and rivers with the lift of their hands. Stories of beings who taught early astronomers, guided early engineers, and left behind structures aligned with the stars. These legends were always treated as metaphors until now, when the ice itself begins to reflect similar geometries. The pulse beneath Antarctica and the sudden freeze millions of years ago share too many characteristics to ignore. Both are clean, precise, intentioned, both appear aligned to cycles far older than Earth's current age, and both map onto the same conclusion. The continent did not become what it is through natural collapse. It was changed. Some ancient tablets describe a catastrophic era when the Earth was retuned, its resonance recalibrated by forces descending from the sky. They speak of a cold curtain drawn to hide the southern machine, and of a long sleep placed upon the land until the stars realign. These fragments were always assumed to be mythical poetry, but the deeper the Antarctic pulse carves its presence into the present day, the more literal these old words feel. If Antarctica was once a cradle of knowledge, a center of energy and alignment, then its abrupt transformation into an ice-locked tomb suggests purpose, not abandonment. Engineers of old civilizations often buried their most sacred mechanisms under layers of protective insulation. What better insulation than a frozen continent? The switch that sealed Antarctica may have served multiple functions: protection, concealment, preservation, perhaps even quarantine. The Anunnaki, if they were the architects the legends claim, were meticulous. They built systems aligned to star cycles, structures that hummed with resonance, chambers designed to wake only when celestial rhythms returned. And now, after an age of stillness, those rhythms are returning. That the pulse beneath the continent matches the core signature of Nibiru is not a coincidence of physics. It is recognition. Something beneath the ice is responding to a familiar voice, one that last echoed across Earth long before humans stood upright. The metallic heartbeat rising through the continent is only one layer of the awakening. The ice forming strange hexagonal fractures is another. But beneath these surface expressions lies a deeper truth. Antarctica is not simply a mass of frozen water resting at the bottom of the world. It is a mechanism. A vast, slumbering construct whose bones were carved in warm soil and later entombed in frost when the time came to hide it from a world not yet ready to understand. When the freeze descended, it did so with a precision that mimics engineered cooling fields rather than atmospheric collapse. Sediment layers show a temperature drop so abrupt it resembles an artificial event, one that bears the hallmarks of a planetary scale intervention. As if the designer sealed the continent with speed, locking a mechanism in place before the world could fracture under its power. And if something that old, that enormous, and that carefully hidden is now stirring, then the switch sealed in deep time may finally be flipping in the opposite direction. The continent that once fell asleep in a single geologic heartbeat is beginning, slowly, subtly, inevitably, to wake. The first radar readings were dismissed as artifacts, glitches produced by interference, atmospheric distortion, or the simple stubbornness of ice refusing to reveal its depth. No one wanted to believe that something geometric could exist beneath a continent shaped by wind and time, but artifacts do not repeat themselves. They do not sharpen with each scan, and they do not arrange themselves into perfect angles beneath 2.5 miles of frozen silence. Yet that is exactly what began to happen. It started with a single corridor, a long narrow void detected by deep penetration radar, extending for dozens of miles in a direction that matched neither natural fault lines nor known glacial movements. The corridor maintained an unbroken width, unwavering even as it passed beneath ridges and valleys. Its walls appeared smooth, too smooth. Ice compresses, fractures, folds. It does not carve itself into straight lines. When researchers adjusted the radar parameters, the corridor multiplied. What had looked like an isolated anomaly resolved into an interconnected lattice, a sprawling network stretching outward like the skeleton of a buried organism. Some passages curved, but most formed angles, sharp, deliberate, mathematical, the type of angles that define blueprints, not landscapes. At deeper layers, the scans returned something even stranger, a cavity shaped like a perfect hemisphere, its surface reflecting seismic waves with the crisp resonance of engineered alloy rather than stone. Natural formations do not curve with such flawless symmetry. Even magma chambers, sculpted by pressure and molten flow, produce irregularities. But this chamber was consistent down to the meter, smooth, geometrically, immaculate, waiting. When the data was compiled into a three-dimensional model, the image that emerged resembled nothing from known geology. It looked instead like something placed with intention, with foresight, with design deep beneath the crust. A structure vast enough to dwarf modern cathedrals. Its purpose unreadable, but its presence undeniable. And as researchers stared at the model glowing on their screens, a quiet truth settled into the room. This was not nature. It was architecture. Somewhere in the process of verifying the scans, an analyst ran a pattern comparison through an old but rarely used database. 1. Holding measurements of ancient structures scattered across the world. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Giza, stone rings aligned to forgotten star maps. The software flagged a correlation almost immediately. The angles within the Antarctic grid matched ratios unique to Anunnaki sites, ratios that scholars had long dismissed as symbolic, decorative, or incidental. But here they were again, reproduced not in stone but in the bones of an entire continent. The resemblance deepened when researchers overlaid the subterranean grid with energy flow diagrams extracted from translated mythological tablets, describing a core lattice said to channel resonance across the surface of Nibiru. The match was not perfect, but close enough to raise a new and unsettling possibility. Antarctica was not merely hiding a structure, it was replicating one, a scaled version of the cosmic grid that once pulsed deep within another world. If this was true, then Earth was not the first planet to cradle such a design. The grid beneath Antarctica behaved unlike any natural formation known to science. When vibrational waves from the surface entered the lattice, the structure redirected them with uncanny efficiency, funneling energy deep into the hemispherical chamber and redistributing the echoes along predetermined pathways. Some of the corridors acted like resonant tubes, others like wave. A few responded only when the 62-second pulse rose from below, as if waking from their own slumber to harmonize with the larger cycle. As measurements continued, something even more startling emerged. Thermal nodes embedded within the grid began to flicker in perfect sync with the pulse. The heating was minimal, not enough to melt ice, but too precise to be random. Each node glowed for exactly 1/3 of each cycle, dimming predictably and reigniting with the next pulse. When mapped, the nodes formed a geometric scatter identical to activation diagrams found in forbidden Anunnaki fragments, diagrams referenced in the same texts that described mechanisms buried beneath the southern vault. Scientists attempting to debunk the data ran simulations, twisting parameters, introducing error signals, even adding artificial distortion to recreate the patterns. Nothing matched. The geometry refused to disappear. It was real. It was old, and it was beginning to wake. More concerning than the geometry, however, was the structure's behavior. When the Antarctic pulse strengthened, the entire grid responded not with collapse or fracture, but with coherence. Regions that had once appeared dormant lit up faintly, like circuitry warming beneath a thin layer of frost. Corridors lengthened, nodes awakened, vibrations traveled faster and more smoothly through the network. And when the pulse weakened, the grid softened but did not return to its original stillness. It remembered. It adapted. Some researchers quietly referred to it as the architect's grid, a name that spread in whispers through classified circles, until even the skeptics used it without irony. The grid felt intentional, it felt alive, and the more it awakened, the more the continent around it shifted in synchrony. When the pulse reached a particularly strong peak one evening, seismic monitors captured something impossible. The hemispherical chamber emitted a secondary hum, higher pitch, shorter duration, layered with harmonic overtones that matched ancient acoustic carvings in Iraqi desert ruins, once attributed to Anunnaki sound engineering. For decades, those carvings had been dismissed as ritual art, but hearing their sonic fingerprint echo from beneath, Antarctica sent shockwaves through the small circle of people allowed to know the truth. It wasn't just architecture, it was communication. The hum resonated through the corridors, shaping the ice above into subtle undulations. Snow drifted upward in swirling spirals. Magnetic compasses twitched, aligning not to Earth's north, but to a point deep below the surface. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the hum faded, but the grid did not return to sleep. Its nodes continued glowing for minutes afterward, as if the structure had received an instruction and was processing it beneath the silence. Engineers reviewing the data noticed something else. The grid responded best when external vibrations matched frequencies recorded near the orbit of Nibiru, the same cosmic signature that first alerted researchers to the Antarctic anomaly. This was not coincidence, it was design. If the Anunnaki built such structures across worlds, then Antarctica was not an outlier. It was a component. A resonant chamber meant to tune Earth to a larger system, a cosmic network spanning distances beyond comprehension. And now, with each pulse rising through ice and stone, the architect's grid was beginning to reactivate, cell by geometric cell, as though it had been waiting patiently for a signal returning from the dark. The moment the first Antarctic nodes began to glow, even faintly, the change was subtle enough that no one outside the classified research channels noticed. A slight rise in temperature beneath a sheet of ice thicker than mountain ranges, a shift in vibrational echo patterns, a softening in the harmonic decay of the 62-second pulse. But the Earth noticed, or rather, parts of the Earth that had long slept beneath their own layers of dust and myth noticed and began to stir. It started with a temple floor in the Peruvian desert. For decades, archaeologists had puzzled over the Nazca lines. Those immense geometric shapes etched into the desert plateau with a precision so vast they can only be understood from the sky. The lines had always been silent, wind-worn, sun-baked, unmoving, but on the night the Antarctic grid brightened, a seismograph station miles away registered a tremor so faint it fell below conventional thresholds. Not an earthquake, not a tectonic shift. A vibrational whisper, repeating in intervals that matched the pulse beneath Antarctica. At first, researchers assumed the reading was noise, until the same whisper appeared beneath the Giza Plateau. The sensors at Giza were not designed to detect resonance. They were intended to monitor structural stability around the Great Pyramid, temperature, humidity, microfractures. Yet without warning, the data streams began to spike in precise, rhythmic patterns. Every 62 seconds, the pyramid's interior stones vibrated just slightly too softly to be felt, but visible as microscopic fluctuations in the readings. The pattern was unmistakable, a harmonic echo of the Antarctic pulse. By dawn, whispers were rising from sites across the globe. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the underwater terraces of Yonaguni, the massive stone rings of Nabda Playa, even the remote megaliths on Easter Island, their silent faces staring eternally at the horizon, registered faint tremors in their foundations. Each location produced the same signature, a subtle alignment with the 62-second rhythm, spreading from the southern pole like ripples on a planetary scale. No one who understood what they were seeing dared to speak the truth aloud. These sites were not connected by culture. They were not connected by time. They were connected by design, a design that had never belonged to humanity. When the data was compiled into a global map, the analysts expected chaos, random distribution, noise. Instead, the echoes formed lines straight, curved, intersecting, bending along the curvature of the Earth. These lines linked the ancient sites into a lattice so vast and so geometrically precise that the room fell silent. It was a blueprint, a planetary overlay, a network waiting for activation. The echo grid. The term spread quickly within classified circles. Unlike the primary Antarctic grid buried deep beneath ice and stone, the echo grid was not hidden. It had been built across Earth's surface, disguised as temples, monoliths, stones, mounds, terraces, and ruins. Structures humans had spent thousands of years worshipping, rebuilding, misinterpreting, or burying beneath layers of myth. Structures that had never been meant for human history at all. Researchers examining the connection between the grids made a chilling discovery. The position of each ancient site aligned with the nodal points of the underlying energy architecture. It was as if early civilizations had stumbled upon the resonant locations of a far older blueprint and attempted to mimic what they found, not knowing they were building atop the bones of a cosmic machine. Some of the sites hummed gently, as if acknowledging a familiar rhythm. Others remained dormant, as though waiting for a threshold of activation yet to come. But they all shared one trait. Each one faced a particular direction, either toward a celestial coordinate or toward the southern pole. And when plotted together, their orientation formed a spiral pattern converging on Antarctica. It was as though the ancient world had been built around a forgotten heart. One researcher described the phenomenon as an orchestra warming to the conductor's cue, a quiet tuning, a soft alignment, the planet, piece by piece, returning to a resonance it had once known. More evidence followed. In South Africa, a stone circle known as Adam's Calendara, structure far older than the Egyptian pyramids, began producing faint magnetic anomalies, not random fluctuations, but rhythmic pulses. In India, the foundation stones of an ancient temple recorded microvibrations in exact synchrony with the Antarctic hum, as if answering a call carried beneath continents. Across the Pacific, Moai statues registered shifts in the soil around them, not from movement, but from vibration. Their bases flexed imperceptibly with each pulse. Instruments measuring the tremors produced sketches that resembled waveguides, channels directing resonance in specific directions that pointed, always toward the south. Meanwhile, ocean sensors detected a different kind of response. Deep-sea currents began to drift along new paths, forming faint spirals visible only in long-range thermal imagery. These spirals mirrored the shapes of the Nazca glyph spirals, identical to the ancient carvings in Sumerian chambers once thought symbolic. Now they seemed less like expressions of faith and more like instructions. diagrams, schematics. When analysts overlaid the activation sites with the architect's grid beneath Antarctica, the match became undeniable. Earth had been designed to function as a singular resonant body. The structures on its surface were not random expressions of culture, but distributed amplification, nodes calibration, points that tuned the planet to a frequency humans had long forgotten. As the pulse strengthened, these nodes began to awaken not violently, not suddenly, but with a slow, quiet inevitability. Some sites glowed faintly in thermal scans. Others resonated in harmonic layers too subtle for the untrained ear. And in the spaces between them in deserts, jungles, oceans, mountains, soft patterns began to form in the land itself, patterns that mirrored the geometry of Nibiru. It was as though the Earth were remembering how to be what it once was always meant to become. The echo grid responded to the pulse beneath Antarctica like a network receiving a long-delayed message, and with every 62-second beat, the message grew stronger, not chaotic, not destructive, but awakening. An ancient system was reactivating not in one place, but everywhere at once, whispering through stone, vibrating through water, breathing through the earth in a rhythm older than any civilization, older than the ice, older than the world humans thought they understood. And somewhere deeper still, beneath the threshold of human perception, the planet seemed to be listening, waiting for the next signal to arrive. Long before humanity gave the comet a name, before telescopes traced its arc, or scientists cataloged its icy composition, something older than astronomy had already taken note of its return. In ancient tablets, etched with a precision that puzzles modern scholars, a wandering star is described not as a threat or omen but as a key celestial trigger, whose arrival would awaken the southern engine beneath the world. Most historians treated these passages as myth. Most never imagined that a comet could communicate. When the Night 3 IATLAS drifted into the inner solar system, something subtle shifted across Earth's southern skies. A faint shimmer appeared in the ionosphere, barely perceptible at first, a trembling in the charged particles that dance across the polar atmosphere. It was so delicate that early instruments dismissed it as background static. Yet beneath the static, a resonance formed. When analysts isolated the frequency, their screens filled with a rhythm they already knew too well. 62 seconds, a perfect mirror of the pulse beneath Antarctica. The data circulated in silence through restricted channels. No one dared submit it to public archives. The pattern was too exact, too deliberate to be coincidence. The comet, still millions of miles away, was responding not to Earth, not to solar winds, but to the buried mechanism that had begun stirring beneath layers of ancient frost. As 3I Atlas approached, drawn along a trajectory unchanged for ages, its magnetic tail began to flex in ways no model predicted. Instead of streaming naturally behind it, the tail twisted slow, deliberate spirals timed to the Antarctic pulse. Space weather instruments captured the change with bewildered precision. With each 62-second cycle, the tail brightened faintly, releasing waves of charged particles synchronized to the heartbeat of the ice. The comet was not merely passing by, it was returning to something, and Antarctica responded. The first visible sign came not from instruments, but from the sky itself. Auroras over the southern pole, typically green curtains rippling across space, began to shift color. Gold seeped into their edges, thin, shimmering threads that pulsed gently with the rhythm rising beneath the continent. Pilots flying at high altitude reported seeing the lights behave less like chaotic storms of charged particles, and more like coordinated streams curving, tightening, forming spirals that looked sculpted by unseen hands. At the surface, seismic monitors registered an uptick in harmonic resonance. Nodes within the architect's grid glowed brighter, some illuminating the ice above them in faint halos visible even to the naked eye. Researchers stationed near the perimeter described the sensation of standing beside a quiet engine coming online. The vibrations were gentle, but they carried a kind of intent, as though the mechanism beneath the ice were testing its strength, stretching after an age of stillness. Then came the surge. It happened just as the comet entered its closest approach to Earth, without warning. The Antarctic pulse doubled in amplitude, not violently, not destructively, but with a sudden clarity that overwhelmed every sensor aimed at the continent. For a moment, the ice hummed like a struck tuning fork. Snow rose from the surface in soft spirals. The wind stilled, as if pushed aside by a force that moved not through air but through the space beneath it. And then the glow began. At first it appeared as faint golden veins threading through the ice, like the traces of dawn slipping beneath a frozen sea. They pulsed in harmony with the grid below, traveling along fracture lines, illuminating the hexagonal geometry with ethereal softness. But as the comet aligned more directly with Earth's magnetic field, the veins brightened, merging into a luminous network that stretched across miles of ice like living circuitry. Those witnessing it from a distance described the sight as impossible, Antarctica shining from within, as though lit by a buried sun. But the grid had one more answer to give. Moments after the glow reached its peak, a column of golden light erupted from the epicenter of the pulse, rising clean and silent through the atmosphere. Not a beam scattered by air or weather, but a structured pillar straight, unwavering, stable as architecture. As it climbed, clouds split around it in concentric rings. Satellites recorded the beam extending far beyond the atmosphere, piercing the exosphere, reaching outward toward the tail of the comet like a hand extended across the void. For 2 minutes, the world held its breath. Sensors across Earth lit up with anomalies, magnetic drift, ionospheric distortion, bursts of electromagnetic noise that followed no terrestrial pattern. The beam vibrated with shifting geometry, repeating ancient sequences identical to diagrams found in forbidden Sumerian fragments and Anunnaki blueprints. It was a message, a signal, a call. And 3I Atlas answered. Astronomers observing the comet reported a pulse of light flickering along its core, subtle but unmistakable. A heartbeat, a reply. For the first time in recorded human history, an object in deep space and a buried structure beneath Earth responded to each other with perfect synchronicity, not gravitationally, not chemically, but through resonance to parts of an ancient system recognizing one another across millions of miles. When the beam faded, the world did not return to normal. Instruments recalibrated themselves without human intervention. Magnetic fields fluttered in elegant arcs rather than chaotic shifts. Even the air carried a faint metallic taste, the residue of charged particles still settling. But it was the silence afterward that unsettled researchers the most. Antarctica did not fall dormant. It settled into a new rhythm, a calm, steady hum that felt less like awakening and more like readiness. As if the signal it had sent was not a question, but a confirmation. As if the comet was not an object passing in the night, but a messenger delivering the key required to unlock the next stage of activation. 3-1 has drifted onward, leaving behind only its tail and a lingering resonance. And beneath the ice, the continent waited, brighter, warmer, more alive than it had been in millions of years, listening for the next movement in a cosmic dialogue too old for human memory, yet newly awakened in the bones of the Earth. The night the beam vanished into the sky, the world should have returned to its familiar silence. Instead, something beneath the surface of ordinary life began to shift, small at first, then unmistakably, unsettlingly synchronized. It was as though the planet had paused, inhaled, and begun exhaling to a different rhythm, one that originated not from the winds or the tides, but from the buried pulse beneath Antarctica. The earliest signs appeared in instruments, not people. Compass arrays positioned across the southern hemisphere quiet, machines built to record minute variations in magnetic drift, began to fluctuate in unison, not wildly, not chaotically, but gently, smoothly, in a synchronized sweep eastward. It lasted less than 20 minutes, yet for those watching the data streams, it was enough to freeze their breath. Earth's magnetic field does not change direction that quickly, and it certainly does not do so in coordinated patterns. But this shift was neither random nor catastrophic. It was timed. It followed the 62-second pulse. It was an answer. Meteorological satellites picked up the next anomaly. Storm systems across the southern oceans began to spiral, not in their usual turbulent swirls, but in tight, elegant curves. Clouds converged into circular formations that mirrored the golden spirals that had danced above Antarctica days earlier. Some systems stalled in place, defying established wind currents. Others reoriented into hexagonal shapes, faintly reminiscent of the ice fractures that had traced the architect's grid. Meteorologists issued cautious internal notes, never intended for public release. Patterns inconsistent with atmospheric norms, possible interference, recheck data integrity. But the data was intact. The sky itself was responding. Then came the oceans. Deep below the surface, sensors monitoring temperature, gradients, and salinity shifts detected spiraling currents stretching across thousands of miles. Warm waters rose where cold waters usually dominated. Cold plumes sank with perfect periodicity. These movements formed delicate loops, folding into themselves like a ribbon being stirred by an invisible hand. Marine researchers described them as too symmetrical to be organic, yet too subtle to disrupt marine life. The oceans were breathing slowly, deeply, rhythmically in harmony with Antarctica. Inevitably, the animals noticed. Whale pods along the Chilean and Australian coasts altered their migration paths. Diverging toward regions historically considered barren, their songs shifted too, dropping into deeper frequencies that matched the Antarctic pulse with eerie precision. Some species produced calls no one had recorded before long, low moans that repeated every 62 seconds, echoing through the water like the Earth itself was singing back. Birds circling the southern oceans flew in spirals rather than arcs, pulled not by wind nor instinct but by something resonating beneath the waves. Even land animals felt it. In Argentina, herds paused mid-stride, lifting their heads as though listening for a voice carried on frequencies beyond human hearing. In Australia, nighttime trackers reported kangaroos freezing in place. Facing south toward the pole for long minutes before resuming their movements, patterns emerged. The closer a species was connected to Earth's magnetic or vibrational fields, the stronger its reaction. Life was aligning itself unconsciously, intimately, with the pulse reawakening beneath the ice. Then it began touching the world humans built. Electrical grids in parts of South Africa and Chile flickered not from overload, but from synchronization. Transformers hummed in deep resonance. Streetlights dimmed and brightened with the same measured rhythm rising from the continent. Engineers attempting to diagnose the problem found no faults, no surges, no explainable cause. The fluctuations moved from city to city like a wave traveling beneath concrete and steel, touching infrastructure the way wind touches grass. In several locations, the hum reached audible levels, not loud, but present like the faint bass of a distant engine, felt more than heard. People described refrigerators vibrating subtly in their kitchens, windows trembling for a moment without wind, floors seeming to pulse beneath their feet. Some thought the sensations were hallucinations. Others felt them so clearly they stepped outside to check if the ground was moving. It wasn't moving. It was responding. Government agencies, flooded with reports, issued public statements dismissing the anomalies as instrument recalibrations or temporary atmospheric disturbances. But internally, panic was rising. Classified task forces exchanged encrypted messages, comparing data points that all led to the same unavoidable conclusion. A coordinated global phenomenon was underway, and its source was the same heartbeat rising from beneath Antarctica. Satellite imagery soon provided the most dramatic evidence yet. A halo of ionized particles formed around the southern hemisphere, glowing luminous bands circling Earth like a crown. It pulsed faintly, breathing in time with the Antarctic grid. Atmospheric scientists observing the formation described it as a ring of living aurora, impossible but undeniably present. Whenever the halo brightened, instruments across multiple continents recorded the same effect: disruptions in radio frequencies, minor fluctuations in atomic clocks, slight deviations in the measurements of gravitational microvariations. Each anomaly matched the pulse precisely. By now, attempts to contain information were failing. Amateur radio operators detected rhythmic distortions, independent weather stations captured spiraling aurora patterns, fishermen reported sea currents moving in circles beneath their boats. Even the digital interference that corrupted dozens of live broadcasts followed the 62-second cycle. But nothing breached global awareness as powerfully as a single leaked satellite photograph. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a strange exposure: Antarctica glowing softly beneath its own ice. But when analysts verified the file, its origin, and its radiometric data, fear spread faster than any official could contain it. The glow was not surface light. It was penetrating upward from deep below, illuminating to miles of ice like frosted glass. For the first time, millions saw what governments had struggled to bury. The continent was lighting itself from within. The reactions varied. Some dismissed it as faked. Others embraced it as prophecy. Scientists scrambled to reinterpret their models. But beneath the noise of speculation, one truth moved quietly, steadily. In the minds of those who recognized the geometry, a planetary mechanism had begun to activate. An earth-ocean, sky, stone, and living things was not resisting. It was answering, and the pulse beneath the ice grew just slightly louder, as if acknowledging the world's reply. Long before the first person reported hearing the hum, the world itself had already fallen into its rhythm. Oceans breathed to it, clouds bent around it, fault lines whispered in time with it. The 62-second pulse had woven itself quietly into the fabric of the planet, into water, into stone, into air. The final boundary left for it to cross was the one no scientist expected, and no government could control: the boundary of human consciousness. It began subtly. A handful of people scattered across the southern hemisphere woke in the middle of the night, certain they had heard something soft, low, and distant, like a metallic breath rising through the floorboards. They described it as a vibration more than a sound, a sensation that brushed the edge of awareness and vanished before they could decide whether it had been real. Most dismissed it. A passing truck, a dream dissolving into waking, the settling of old houses. But the hum returned, always faint, always soft, always precise. Each pulse separated from the next by 62 seconds. By the end of the first week, reports appeared across Argentina, Chile, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. Entire neighborhoods noted moments of sudden stillness: birds falling silent, pets lifting their heads, windows trembling imperceptibly. Some felt a pressure in their ears, others a warmth behind the eyes, a sensation that came and went like a tide no one could see. Doctors blamed stress, meteorologists blamed atmospheric interference, engineers blamed faulty wiring, but the rhythm remained. It seeped into everyday life like a faint echo of something enormous turning beneath the world. Then came the dreams. At first, they were scattered, disconnected. A miner in Patagonia dreamt of golden corridors beneath ice. A college student in Perth woke in tears after seeing spirals of light descending from a darkened sky. A sailor in Cape Town described a massive silhouette rising from a frozen sea, its edges sharp and geometric like the outline of a sleeping mountain made of metal. None of them knew one another. None had read the same news or watched the same broadcasts. And yet, the images were identical. Word spread through private messaging groups. People whispered online about shared dreams, though no one dared say the word shared outright. Some described hearing the hum inside the dream itself, a deep, slow resonance that vibrated through the air like the heartbeat of a machine too large for the mind to hold. Night after night, the dreams grew clearer. the golden corridors became more defined. The spirals of light began to move, rotating in perfect geometry. The silhouette beneath the ice grew taller, sharper, as though awakening slowly beneath the dreamer's own eyelids. Within closed circles of neuroscientists, panic began to brew. Brain imaging centers in Australia reported an anomaly, faint synchronous spikes in auditory cortex activity, appearing at intervals exactly matching the Antarctic pulse. The spikes were too small to cause symptoms, too subtle to be dangerous, but far too precise to be random. Brains in different cities, different countries, different continents were responding to the same external rhythm, not physically, through resonance. Researchers described it as entrainment, the process by which a stronger, consistent rhythm pulls a weaker one into alignment. It is the principle behind how crowds begin clapping in unison without trying, or how women living together sometimes synchronize their menstrual cycles, or how heart cells in a dish pulse together, even when separated. But this entrainment was global. It feels like something is listening through us. One neuroscientist wrote in a private memo that was never meant to leave her lab, or perhaps remembering us. The more the pulse strengthened, the more the dreams deepened. People began to see structures, massive, honeycomb-like chambers carved with angles impossible for human architecture. Some described the view from above, as if flying over the architect's grid itself. Others described descending into spirals of light, leading to a core of glowing metal that pulsed like a living heart. One recurring figure emerged, a towering presence, neither human nor beast, its form obscured in shadow but unmistakably massive. It did not threaten, it did not speak. It stood as though awakening slowly, inevitably with each pulse beneath the ice. Anthropologists studying the dream reports made a chilling observation. The images matched descriptions found in ancient Sumerian tablets records referring to the sleeper beneath the southern gate. A being made not of flesh, but of engineered geometry, a mountain that breathes, a storm that thinks. As weeks passed, the hum grew subtly stronger. People who lived near coastlines felt it beneath their floors. Those in cities felt it in the pause between traffic vibrations. Musicians described hearing new harmonics inside familiar notes. Some swore their heartbeat occasionally matched the 62-second rhythm, forming a moment of eerie internal stillness. Even those who never heard the hum began feeling an inexplicable moment every hour or so when their thoughts seemed to slow, sharpen, pause, as if held gently by an invisible hand. Governments tried to suppress the emerging panic, issuing statements, blaming mass hysteria, but they could not suppress the data. Neuroimaging centers around the world recorded synchronized micropulses in subjects separated by oceans. Psychologists documented thousands of identical dream accounts. Magnetic resonance studies showed faint but real shifts in brainwave frequencies toward the Antarctic pattern. Something ancient was touching the human mind. Not violently, not aggressively, but intimately. As if reminding our species of a memory buried too deep for history, too old for language or resonance that once guided the rhythms of a world shaped not by chance, but by design. And as the pulse grew warmer, slower, more deliberate, the dreams changed. No longer corridors, no longer spirals. Dreamers began seeing a horizon splitting open, a vast, radiant threshold, as though Earth itself was preparing to meet something returning from beyond the sky. And in the quiet afterward, the 62-second hum continued, soft, steady, patient, as if the mind of the world had joined the pulse beneath the ice. And the next stage was already on its way. By the time human dreams began to align with the Antarctic pulse, the planet had already crossed a threshold. The grid beneath the ice was no longer simply awakening, it was synchronizing. Not just with the oceans, or the sky, or the deep-rooted plates of the Earth, but with the entire planetary system. Something older than continents, older than weather, older than life itself had begun to hum beneath the crust. And Earth responded the way a sleeping body responds to a distant voice. Slowly, instinctively, inevitably, the shift began in silence. Sensors across Antarctica detected an unexpected pause in the 62-second cycle. A stillness so precise, so absolute, that even the most skeptical analysts felt their breath catch for 3 full beats. The world waited, the oceans stilled, the atmospheric spirals softened, the magnetic halo dimmed by a fraction so small, only the most sensitive instruments registered it. And then, the pulse returned. Not stronger, not faster, deeper. Its resonance dropped into a lower harmonica tone, so subtle, it passed beneath the floor of human hearing and entered the bones. Seismic instruments reported waves that rolled not across the surface but through the mantle, moving with the steadiness of a mechanical breath, filling a chamber larger than any blueprint had ever imagined. In that moment, the grid shifted. Nodes beneath Antarctica unlocked from their fixed geometric positions, not physically, but energetically. They slid along invisible rails, forming new shapes, new alignments. Like gears turning within a machine the size of a continent, thermal scans showed glowing corridors rearranging themselves, spiraling outward in expanding rings that matched the earliest activation diagrams found in forbidden Sumerian texts. For the first time, researchers recognized the pattern. It was the second stage, the part of the mechanism ancient tablets had called the alignment of the returning gate. And all across the world, the Earth responded. Mountains in South America released faint plumes of warmth from their roots. The Australian outback glowed with thin lines of heat visible only through deep infrared. The deserts of northern Africa, silent for ages, trembled with rhythmic pulses that traveled in perfect synchronization with Antarctica. Ocean floors shifted gently, deliberately, trench currents twisted into luminous spirals. Deep-sea vents inhaled and exhaled thermal plumes, like lungs adjusting to a new rhythm. Marine biologists recorded species migrating along geometric paths that mirrored the underlying blueprint, as though following a map older than evolution. Above the surface, the atmosphere formed hexagonal clusters, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Clouds aligned into honeycomb patterns, so vast they stretched for hundreds of miles. Jet streams bent into loops that matched the architected grid. Air pressure readings rose and fell in cycles that echoed the Antarctic pulse. It was as though the planet itself had become a single organism, water, air, and life entwined into a shared breathing. And then came the pillars. At locations across the globe, mountain peaks, deserts, coastal bluff sensors detected vertical resonance waves rising from the crust, invisible to the eye, but detectable as faint spirals of pressure twisting upward toward the upper atmosphere. At their peaks, golden arcs flickered thin, shimmering curls of ionized air forming rings that rotated slowly, patiently, like watchful eyes gazing upward. When analysts overlaid their positions on ancient Sumerian star maps, the match was perfect. These were the coordinates of the stairway of return, a structure not built of stone, but of alignment. A ladder made not for climbing, but for resonance. A bridge formed from the world itself. The second stage had begun. Yet for all the vastness of its scale, the shift unfolded with a gentleness that defied expectation. No earthquakes split the land, no storms tore through cities. Instead, Earth adapted gracefully, adjusting its weight, its currents, its breath in ways subtle enough to evade global panic. But the researchers watching the blueprint knew the truth. This was not stabilization. This was preparation. The alignment deepened, Antarctica's glow softened into a steady golden heartbeat beneath the ice. The pulses spread across continents with the coherence of a signal sent through a colossal circuit. Rivers shifted temperature. Fault lines hummed. Deserts exhaled faint heat. Even human consciousness, now quietly entrained to the rhythm, fell into a hush that felt strangely expectant. The earth seemed to be waiting, and then came the wind down, a softening of everything. Winds slowed, tides smoothed. The halo around the southern hemisphere dimmed into a pale, warm shimmer. Even the stars above seemed to hold their twinkling a fraction longer, as though adjusting to the new alignment of the world below. This was the quiet before the deeper movement, the pause between one breath and the next, the stillness of a system coiling gently toward its next task. A few scientists, those allowed to see the raw data, whispered the unthinkable. Earth is no longer behaving like a planet. It is behaving like a mechanism. But for most of humanity, the transition felt strangely peaceful. Nights seemed softer. The air carried a faint warmth even in winter. People described an inexplicable calm settling into their minds, as though the world itself were humming a low lullaby beneath everything. And while no one could hear the Antarctic voice directly, they sensed it, a deep, patient presence moving beneath the crust, preparing for something approaching from beyond the sky. The stairway of return was aligning. The gate was forming. Earth had taken its steps. Now it waited for the next pulse, one that would not come from within, but from the deep, ancient dark the comet had journeyed through. And in the soft stillness that followed, the world exhaled. A long, gentle breath of readiness. A breath that carried a message older than humanity. This is only the beginning. Settle now into the stillness of the world as it becomes something new. The pulse beneath Antarctica no longer presses for attention. It drifts gently, like a distant drum softened by snowfall, a rhythm woven into the air you breathe. You do not hear it, not truly, but your body remembers its cadence. The oceans remember. The sky remembers. And somewhere deep beneath the crust, the ancient mechanism folds itself into a softer harmony, conserving its strength for whatever comes next. Imagine the ice in the far south, glowing with a warmth that does not melt it, a golden ember preserved within miles of white silence. Above it, the auroras fade into thin ribbons of light, drifting across the sky like slow-moving lanterns. Clouds hesitate before they pass, as though pausing to listen. Even the winds quiet, carrying only the faint hint of something waiting just beyond the edge of perception. Let your breath match the rhythm of the planet, slow, steady, unhurried. The world has entered a state of rest, not sleep. A gentle alignment, a calm before movement. Every continent now holds a faint echo of the Antarctic hum, soft vibrations in stone, subtle warmth in soil, delicate shifts in the patterns of water and air. Life adjusts without panic. Cities sway imperceptibly with the planet's new cadence. The night sky tilts just slightly, revealing constellations that seem more patient than before. Nothing demands your urgency. Nothing calls for fear. You are simply witnessing a chapter, turning a deep, ancient inhale, held between one age and the next. The blueprint dimmed not from exhaustion, but from readiness. Quiet readiness. A poised calm that stretches across the world like a soft veil, guiding you gently towards sleep, toward stillness, toward the promise of what may return. Rest here with the hum. Let the silence hold you. The story continues, but for now, breathe with the waiting world.